I am a Sony pony. That's right, baby. I rep Sony till I die. I got the Sony shirt. I got the Sony accessories. I got the Sony socks that I bought just for this. You can't. I don't think you can see them. One sec. All right, hold on. Just one. Give me. Okay. All right. You can. Oh my god. I used to be so much more athletic. Those ones right there. I got those. I got the PG-13 PS1 colorway. I even have the Sony. Okay, this joke is harder to pull off than I thought it would be. I have a Sony tattoo. That's real. If it wasn't, could I do this? I'm just doing this so my editor has to do more work. Oh wait, I'm the editor. God, I'm so stupid. But as much as I am PS1 till I die, I'll murk an Xbot if you ever try and step to me. I have to admit, there's been some shenanigans over at PlayStation headquarters. That pesky raccoon's at it again. And I think enough has happened with Sony recently that we need to do a bit of a check-in. It's nothing too concerning. We're not abandoning ship or anything, okay? We just gotta do a bit of a vitals check. A couple of weeks ago, Jim Ryan announced his retirement. Jimothy has been the head of PlayStation for about 5 years, and his time at the top had some mixed reception. On one hand, PlayStation has been insanely profitable during his time there. He guided the release of the PS5, whose only real hiccup was the lack of initial supply, which was an issue that was sort of out of his hands. And most importantly, the games that have come out during the Jimmy era have been pretty good. On the other hand, some people thought he had the charisma of a dead rat that had been left on a windowsill for 96 hours. He's made a clear and strong push towards games as a service, which is a gamer slur. And given the release cycle of modern AAA titles, the stuff that's been released in the last few years might say more about the work of previous execs like Andrew House and Sean Layden than Jim himself, or should I say, him Jimself. He has a very boring name, I'm just trying to spice it up. And because of that kind of delayed response, the future of this brand might actually be set for the next few years. The Jim Ryan effect might be felt for the remainder of the PS5's lifecycle, but whoever takes over permanently, since they've only announced an interim CEO, will be responsible for either expediting what's now been set in motion or engaging in a bit of a course correct. And so, after thinking about it long and hard, I have decided to bear the weight of that decision-making process myself. Sony, I accept your offer of being promoted from unemployed to CEO of your company. Let's talk about the future. It's no secret that PlayStation's been riding the games as a service kick recently. They've acquired multiple studios who seem to be working on live service games, Deviation, Haven, Firewalk, Fire Sprite, and their tenured studios like Naughty Dog, Insomniac, and Sucker Punch have all been putting out job listings for multiplayer projects, including the unofficially titled Last of Us Factions from Naughty Dog. They even acquired Bungie a little while ago to help with making these, which, if you keep track, means that the creators of Halo are now under Sony and Crash Bandicoot is now owned by Microsoft, so that makes me feel uncomfortable. Now, if you ask PlayStation fans what they think about this change, most of them would say that they don't like it. PlayStation should focus back on what made them work in the first place and what defined their brand: strong, story-focused single-player games. Games as a service almost always fail. Look at Avengers, Redfall, Anthem, Lord have mercy on Babylon's Fall. That game basically existed for like a total of a week. There are so many critical failures. Why would you put all your eggs in this basket? And I feel like that's a somewhat natural response to have, but it also feels a little bit like a hearty bowl of selective information with a side of revisionist history. For starters, people were complaining for years that Sony's games were too one-dimensional. During the PS4 generation, we saw them shed a lot of their multiplayer franchises or multiplayer modes and hard focus on narrative-driven third-person action-adventure games, and that lack of variety was the subject of a lot of scrutiny. Now, in fairness, they were by far the best at making these games, and people loved them. We never wanted them to stop being made. But I don't think the critique of PlayStation being too one-note was unfounded. There was an over-homogenization going on, and the longer that it stayed that way, the less patient people would likely get. So yes, PlayStation needed and still needs homegrown multiplayer games. In fact, coming to that conclusion as early as they did might have actually been extremely important foresight, considering the biggest publisher of live service titles, which historically has made a ludicrous amount of money for Sony, is now officially, as of the morning of this recording, owned by their main competitors. So it is kind of important for them to push out viable alternatives to stop the bleeding a little for them financially. Even if some of these games aren't going to be exclusive to Microsoft, Call of Duty, Overwatch, Diablo, Sea of Thieves, Minecraft, Elder Scrolls Online, Forza, and Fallout 76 are all cards that Xbox owns, and every single one of those games or series are massive moneymakers. And that brings up another important point, which is that, yeah, there are countless examples of live service games coming out and absolutely belly flopping on release and earning themselves a reputation of being wholly terrible for the industry. But to act like companies and devs are silly to even try to make them is just ignoring the fact that basically all of the most profitable games of the last few years have been live service first titles, and a lot of them started off pretty mediocre or straight up horrible. A lot of people judged AC Valhalla for being boring, repetitive, and cash grabby, even for a Ubisoft game, and here it is, by far the most profitable Ubisoft title to date. Destiny was criticized when it first came out for being too bare bones and lacking any interesting story, and it's now the golden boy of live service. GTA Online, still being played by an insane number of people, live service. Warzone, Fortnite, Apex, live services. I mean, people were treating Fallout 76 like it was holding their family hostage and setting their houses on fire, and Bethesda is still making money hand over fist from it. I don't like a lot of it. I don't like how most of these games treat the first few years like a glorified early access period, or prey on susceptible people including children for unbelievably overpriced skins, or design themselves around monotonous tasks to limit your progression so they can keep you playing an inferior product for longer, but you can't say the demand isn't there. In a perfect world, Sony diversifies with different styles of single-player games, and their multiplayer stuff uses the older, more traditional model that doesn't require battle passes and purchasable dance moves for Kratos, but live service games that do succeed are basically golden geese, and almost the entire multiplayer sector of the industry has shifted to being games as a service, so to hope for the ideal is wishful thinking. What are you gonna do, stop people from playing cash-grabby multiplayer games? Good luck, people still play NBA 2K. To make just a blanket statement that games as a service are destined to fail and they aren't potentially a good business decision is just turning a blind eye to what's been happening in gaming since World of Warcraft and RuneScape. And if you're a big company with deep pockets, you'd probably take the risk of funding 4 or 5 huge $100 million live service games and having all but one of them kick the bucket almost instantly. Because if that one takes off, it recoups the cost of all of these games combined in like a year's time and then becomes unbelievably profitable in the years to come. So many low quality games that just had an ungodly amount of money dumped into them post-release wound up being successful and paying dividends dozens of times over. And I genuinely think that Sony is expecting most of these multiplayer projects to flop and trying to game the system through sheer quantity. They're just throwing shit at the wall and hoping something sticks, because if it does, that makes the shit slinging worth it. We're all on the same page that these games are usually not that exciting, that the latest PS showcase revolving around games like these was disheartening, and Sony is barreling headfirst into multiple critical failures with them. But there also is a demonstrable upside, and I can't exactly blame the company for trying to capitalize on what's drawing the most attention. This is a massive market which makes more money than any corner of the industry besides mobile, and over the last few years, Sony has been almost entirely iced out of it. And that might not be a popular opinion, but as somebody who doesn't even play live service games, I feel like Sony has to be part of this race somehow. It's too important to casual audiences to just ignore it. What does concern me though is how that live service push is kind of seeping into the single player studios at Sony. With the way that Jim Ryan and Herman Hulst were talking about the future, it seemed like a big part of their plan was creating standalone multiplayer experiences out of their well-recognized IP, like Horizon, The Last of Us, and Ghost of Tsushima. Most of the powerhouse Sony development studios have been linked in some way to multiplayer projects, which is something that actually excited me a lot at first. I was on board with the pitch for The Last of Us Factions. Ghost of Tsushima Legends was a small project but a lot of fun, and most of these studios have made well-liked multiplayer projects in the past. Naughty Dog has had some kind of multiplayer or co-op mode in their games ever since Uncharted 2, besides The Last of Us 2 because its multiplayer mode is meant to be the new Factions title. Insomniac's Resistance franchise featured a pretty criminally under-discussed multiplayer mode, and Guerrilla Games was the face of PS-exclusive multiplayer games for a while with Killzone. On paper, this works. Some of the best studios in the world at the peak of their powers finding a way to fuse their single-player identity with social and replayable features? That sounds too good to be true. And it might just be. The Last of Us Factions was in theory supposed to be our first real look at how this was gonna work, and that is like a hop, skip, and a jump away from being outright cancelled at this point. Bungie reportedly came in and tore the game a new asshole, saying it would never work, and now it's in limbo state by all accounts. If the project does officially get cancelled, there's gonna be a lot of people complaining about the studio's time being wasted on a failed multiplayer title instead of focusing on what they do best. And even if that's an oversimplification of how companies and studios work, and it's not like the same money, manpower, and resources could have just gone to a different project this whole time, it kinda doesn't matter, because at that point it's about public perception, and that's hard to shake. Sony's most important commodity, especially when it comes to retaining their core fan base, is still its single-player first-party lineup. And if people start feeling like these studios are getting put on side quests and more of these rumored titles meet a similar fate to this one, which isn't unlikely considering how volatile this style of game is nowadays, you start reversing some of that goodwill and understanding with your player base. And that player base is still gonna buy all the single-player stuff they've come to love, and Sony Sony's not dumb enough to straight up abandon what's been working for them for the last 20 years, but for those 20 years, putting aside a couple of gas leak years in the middle, PlayStation has been a monolith defined by its consistently great exclusive games and cutting-edge dev teams. If you begin to dilute that, it doesn't exactly inspire a lot of confidence from consumers. And as the new CEO of the company, I think it's time to separate church and state. I am sure that there are people and teams at all of these studios capable of making great multiplayer games, but there's an inherent risk to that, and we've already seen it with just one example, and not even an official cancellation, how everyone has gone from excited about factions to treating it as an omen of PlayStation's downfall if they continue their live service push. Everyone's asking Sony to abandon live service games, but I say use those new acquisitions, use Bungie, create new standalone multiplayer IP, even if most of it blows up in your face. Maybe get your big studios to consult or help out on projects made by these new studios that use more established IPs they've developed and spin them off, but steer the focus and the narrative back to your big studios working on the single player titles they do best. Shifting from putting 88% of your budget into single player games and 12% on live service to a 55-45 split in favor of live service in 4 years is a ridiculous figure. There's gotta be a better compromise. I honestly couldn't care less if all these new studios are solely working on multiplayer stuff, because what am I really losing in that scenario? But if Sucker Punch takes another 7 years to make a game and it's a multiplayer Ghost spin-off that doesn't stick, that's when I start feeling shortchanged. I just need more confidence that that classic Sony experience is still going strong, and that 88 to 45% drop-off is not instilling that confidence. Which actually brings us to a change that I've liked a lot recently, which is the kind of half sequels that they've been developing for their most popular franchises like Lost Legacy and Miles Morales. I really like the idea of these smaller but still original high quality games in these series. I've been a huge proponent of the idea that Sony needs to build out its library outside of the massive releases that come out about twice a year, and I think these games are one way to do that. Santa Monica also seems to be following suit with a rumored God of War spin-off, which I'd be willing to bet is going to follow Atreus, and that sounds great. This is something that I definitely want them to continue doing. But speaking of smaller games that build out their library, has anybody noticed how inconsistent their indie program has been? Right at the beginning of the PlayStation 5's life cycle, we saw a ton of indie titles get announced, and I know people get their honchos in a hissy fit that these games aren't actually indies, but they're called PlayStation. Can you just not be a nerd for like 10 seconds and just go with it? Kenna Bridge of Spirits, Sifu, Stray, Solar Ash, He Who Shall Not Be Named, BoJack Horseman for people who wanted to bang Charlotte, all announced basically at the same time, all releasing within a year and some change from that announcement, with a couple being lost to the void. For a little bit we got updates and big announcements of games joining the lineup, but it's been dead quiet for a good amount of time now. All of these games were really great additions to their catalog, and the look and polish of each was unmatched, which meant that more than just being a bunch of good indie games, it felt like there was a clear vision and identity for PlayStation indies, but it's kinda MIA right now. I think that should be a bigger part of Sony's future. The buzz that games like Sifu and Stray generated shouldn't be overlooked, and considering how some indie devs have issues with how Sony sets up the PSN store because it sort of buries its indies in a deep dark cave, improving their relationship with that part of the community is an important move. If you think about it though, the entire slate of upcoming PlayStation games is sort of at an awkward pause. We don't really even know what first-party games are coming out next year besides Concord, which it looks kind of flimsy, okay? I wouldn't be surprised if it got pushed to 2025. We have a few inklings of their future, some games that might release next year, but the momentum they gained as the PS4 hit the end of its life cycle and we had a smooth transition into the PS5 has now almost entirely died down, especially with the release of Spider-Man 2. For the first time in a long time, it feels like we're just awkwardly twiddling our thumbs wondering what Sony's gonna do next. Even though he just announced his retirement, this might actually be the major transition period where we see the seeds of Jim Ryan's time at PlayStation finally bear fruit. And while they're in a secure enough position for this to not be enough to hit the Mayday button, there's potentially a rough road ahead for the next few years depending on if some of his risks pay off or not. And at a time where their arch rivals are just vacuuming up every company in the entire industry as a counterattack, they might be facing some big problems. And I guess as the new CEO, it's up to me to fix it.